Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second part of this course, Ruth Asawa's paper web. We're going to get started in just a few seconds here. We have another great turnout today. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know me from the last session, my name is Jason Vardakar. I am a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow here at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And it's my pleasure to take you on this second part of Ruth Asawa's paper web, a course which considers the major artist Ruth Asawa, whom I hope many of you are familiar with at this point, who you can see in this lovely photograph here from late in her life. From 1998, she died in 2013, so the last decade or so of her life, drawing loquats at night. And I want to begin here thinking about this artist as, and I say this very seriously, as an artist who was a kind of Mother Nature figure. She was very interested in representing, but more than that, in creating very serious evocations of nature, including in iconic biomorphic hanging wire sculptures, which we discussed last time, and for which she has become very well known. Ruth Asawa, as a quick review, grew up in Norwalk, California, and she had Japanese heritage at a time of rampant anti-Asian and especially anti-Japanese and anti-Chinese sentiment. She was born in 1926, so 3 years after the Japanese Exclusion Act was passed by the US Congress. There were many laws based on eugenic science, openly eugenic science. And at far right, you see the Eugenics Record Office on Long Island that was part of Cold Spring Harbor that produced some of the literature and testimony that would become the basis of this fundamentally racist act, the Asian Exclusion Act. And at lower left, you see a vitriolic neighbor nearby where Ruth Asawa grew up on that farm she drew at upper right later in her life, that spare place where she and her family would farm vegetables, strawberries for the community. This neighbor baldly displaying some of the challenges, the oppression that this artist faced. Asawa, as many of you will already know, was placed forcibly into an internment camp along with her whole family after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. She was eventually in Rower internment camp where she went to high school, although she ended up at Black Mountain College. This is a brief review. So she ended up in Black Mountain College near Asheville, North Carolina. And in the mountains there on the wooded campus, she was one of the first students of color to integrate a school in a state that was really not integrating at the time. And the woods were burning around Black Mountain when Asawa arrived there. And you see her photographed with Ora Williams in the upper left. She learned from teachers like Josef Albers, who you see at right, teaching his students about the importance of paper, which he described as having a kind of a pulse or a kind of presence, a heartbeat, an idea that Asawa would embrace throughout her life. Why? Because paper is definitely literally made from cellular, from living material, often from pulp that was many times derived from trees or plant products. But that's just the basic level. It's also about paper's infinite malleability and kind of reproducibility that can be folded and refolded and unfolded. It can breathe almost like an accordion, opening and closing. It has a kind of morphology that is almost biological, or at least kind of very, very mathematical or fractal-like. And you see Albers folding paper in an exercise there, paper that is folded not just as an exercise alone, but is connected to the way that artists were thinking at Black Mountain College and teaching at Black Mountain College. That is, that art had the power to transform society, that art had the power to equalize people. You can see Ruth Asawa in 1978 remembered that when Josef Albers talked about art, he talked about democracy, he talked about equality, and paper and its reproducibility, its malleability, its almost lifelike presence to Albers as a material and as an exercise, I think was in some way connected to that democracy, that that sense of that sense of presence that an artist can evoke, that belongs to all of us, and that didn't belong to everyone. That kind of equality, that presence, that subjectivity at the time for World War II had shown the world, vis-a-vis Hitler's atrocities, the Holocaust, how racism had wreaked havoc on the world, but also the racism and the segregation in the United States that by 1949 caused the United Nations Educational and Scientific Organization, UNESCO, newly formed, to make a statement on race, the first statement on race that year, that declared that all human beings are equal at a fundamental level because of the fact that, like paper, we are cut from the same cloth. We are made from cells, we are made from DNA, we are made from molecules, particles that make us all, in a sense, the same. Yeah, kind of universalism that I'm not afraid to say, was, I think, very rampant in this moment, and that Albers embraced. And you can see the UNESCO inaugurated UNESCO headquarters in Paris in 1958 by Marcel Brauer, that has a kind of carport or porch or portico that may relate to Albers' kind of folded paper. That paper could take wing, could be like a bird as much as a fractal, or the structures of a leaf, or perhaps even of energy. These scientific concepts that depart from nature's order, that Albers and many others like Brauer believed unified all of humankind. The stakes for Asawa's work were as such. This is the last kind of review slide. Ruth Asawa at Black Mountain College was studying biology, and she, for example, was studying mitosis, the process of cells undergoing division. And she even probably owned this textbook at Center, a page of which is featured, showing this two-lobed, right, bicellular diagram of mitosis. And at the far right is from Ruth Asawa's BMC, Black Mountain College biology notebook, where she was, in fact, illustrating that process of mitosis, of cell division. And then the first hanging lobed wire sculpture that Ruth Asawa ever made, on your screen as well, the same year that the UNESCO First Statement on Race came out, the same year she studied cell division in biology. That gets to perhaps the greater stakes of her work, that like Albers, like the Black Mountain College faculty there was a belief that art could teach us that we're all equal. For Asawa, this may have been cellular, molecular even, or if not, at least metaphorical, in the sense that this hanging lobed wire sculpture may iterate that, may evoke that sense that we are all, in a way, reduplicating cells. However, this was not unique, certainly, to Black Mountain College or to Ruth Asawa. On your screen is a work by the artist Isamu Noguchi, who had Japanese heritage and also European heritage, and who, in this work that the Whitney owns, worksheets for sculpture from 1945, so around the same time Asawa was developing her voice at Black Mountain College, is producing such diagrams, which are made of this, layers of cut paper and graphite drawing, to kind of figure out how he's going to construct his sculptures. Sure, but what does this have to do with a sense of universalism or the stakes that we've discussed around Ruth Asawa? Well, I'm not sure exactly, but the artist seems to have been interested in biomorphic forms that often suggested not just the body, maybe these elbows or leg-like forms on the screen here, but oftentimes molecular or perhaps even chromosomal forms. A lot of times he would make sculptures that had these kind of oblong shapes with kind of protrusions on them, similar to period textbooks that also had these kind of diagrams of chromosomes. And chromosomes, of course, right, are the fundamental kind of unit in a way, and even in this time, of what constitutes our kind of biological identity, supposedly, right? It contains our DNA as a roadmap for what we look like, et cetera, et cetera. And Isamu Noguchi himself was an artist who had a complicated relationship to his own identity. For example, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when many Japanese Americans or people with Japanese heritage living in America were put in internment camps, Noguchi was not. He was allowed to travel and move around, and he maintained a kind of intermediate position in his life between the kind of upper classes or stratospheres of the art world and the subjection of being a erased human being in American society in this moment. And so what does this have to do with the diagram we're looking at? Well, to me, there's something in these component parts that Noguchi has schematized, cannibalized on this graph paper, almost a kind of engineering or science like ground, right? A laboratory ground that Noguchi here has arranged with, yes, these perhaps chromosomal forms, but more than that, he's particleized them in a sense, as if this graphite paper is a petri dish that he has spread with care, like in the laboratory, these component parts. An exercise he perhaps did not have to do. Noguchi nonetheless brings all these together, these particles together on one sheet, as if to make a roadmap for the sculpture that is also a roadmap in a way for what it might have felt like for Noguchi to navigate his component parts, his particleized self. He often called himself, or at least in one letter, he called himself a Eurasian, quote unquote, person, an idiosyncratic term that betrays his own kind of, I think, racial thinking and perhaps racial anxiety, understandably. And it may seem to read far too much into this abstract, biomorphic, schematic Noguchi's ambivalence, racial ambivalence, but I find that part of what makes this work so beautiful. The elbowing, lava lamp-like, chromosomal, particle-like forms on this Noguchi's petri dish, which bow towards each other, which seem to goop and move towards and away from each other, as if in an exquisite state of sustained departure, not amalgamation, but poised to be put together to make a sculpture and to become one thing, one, in this case, let's say, human being or human-like form, an anthropomorphic form, or at least as many of Noguchi's sculptures would come to be called, the self, or a self-referential form. Isamu Noguchi was not the only artist who grappled with these issues of how to visualize the universal in the face of often erratic and damaging differences created by American society in their moment. Yasao Kuniyoshi, one of my favorite artists, who's very well represented here at the Whitney Museum, and I encourage you to see his work on the 7th floor, which is very frequently on display. Here gives us another case study that is Asawa adjacent, and I think helps us to see her work more deeply, the stakes of her paper web. Yasao Kuniyoshi was an artist, again, with Japanese heritage. However, he was part of a group of artists who were living in New York City between about 1920 and 1940, who were associated with curators and critics who were really interested in getting society, getting American people to notice the common folk, the people on Main Street. They felt this was an overlooked group who had a lot to offer in the way of human experience. And the way they thought they could get people to understand the experience of folk American life, normal in a way, mainstream American life, was to look to the objects from their daily life, instruments, figurines, dolls, blankets, country American furniture, as well as kind of vernacular painting, including this work at Wright, which is a theorem painting at the Metropolitan Museum from like 1840, 1860, that was understood as kind of part of, just the stage, of the American countryside in a way. It's floral, right? It's delectable fruits on display on a cutting board, giving us a sense in its very period way of the abundance, I would say even like God's Christian abundance given to Americans in their husbandry of what were even then relatively newly settled and colonized places. Kuniyoshi himself collected American folk art like this. And that's how we get that name, American folk art, because this group of artists that included Kuniyoshi and critics and writers kind of grouped together under that heading, American folk art. And Kuniyoshi had a pretty big collection that he displayed in his upstate New York Woodstock home. And Kuniyoshi often derived forms from American folk art and put it into his work. What does this have to do, right, with visualizing a kind of universalism? Well, Kuniyoshi, like I said, had Japanese heritage, and he faced a lot of oppression throughout his life. For example, he grew up in California. He lived almost his entire life there, but he was denied U.S. citizenship completely. He after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, was placed under house arrest and put under pretty severe surveillance by the FBI. He was, subject to all the kind of, as you would imagine, anti-Asian sentiment at this moment that we've discussed. But the thing that kind of bothered Yasao Kuniyoshi the most, if you read his personal papers, was something that also bothered Ruth Asawa. But here I'll be specific about Kuniyoshi. What bothered him the most was that critics and curators, for example, would look at a work of art like the one you see on your screen now, and they would interpret it as imbued with a kind of Asian flavor, quote unquote, or a kind of Asian aesthetic. Kuniyoshi said that he drew from his heritage sometimes in his work, but it was certainly not the only thing he was interested in. And in fact, if you look at works like this, like the one on your screen, Morning Glory and Weeds, to me, it's much more of a piece with the kind of theorem painting that Kuniyoshi would have admired and later collected in his life. This work, ink on paper, sure, and lots of negative space, sure, elements from certain traditions that Kuniyoshi would have been familiar with from his heritage of painting. But two, look at the rich striations, the depth, the kind of chiaroscuro that Kuniyoshi creates by saturating the paper with the kind of dark ink center, and then leaving it such this almost electric lightning-like light of the stem of the vine carves through it at center, kind of moving our eye snake-like through this abundant terroir, this moment of at least to me, like leaves almost in moonlight or something, kind of blossoming or kind of exploding in a moment of expressive encounter with the viewer that to me is not totally unlike the theorem painting at Wright that you see has a very saturated dark fruit that kind of meets or slices into perhaps a kind of crescent-shaped melon or something like that. The kind of chiaroscuro or contrast in both that delights the eye, that gives us a sense of nature's full spectrum, is on offer for sure. Another exquisite example, also in our collection, of Kuniyoshi's perhaps interest in these kinds of vernacular forms, elements of staging from American folk painting, from theorem painting, also appear here. As you can see, a kind of very foregrounded set of flora that is almost presenting itself to us, like the leaves opening out to us, like beckoning to us, stating their abundance, their unfurling insistence from the land. There's a kind of in the distance, like little tiny trees, a kind of a false, almost Grandma Moses-like perspective that reaches back into space. There's a feeling of the page being empty, because this devotional object, this flora, is really the subject on offer for us. So again, all elements of American folk art that Kuniyoshi would have loved, and that he leaned into throughout his life, even when critics and curators said that he painted women, for example, in a quote unquote, and this is a racist word that was used to describe him, an Oriental way, that he denied that. And in fact, in 1948, Kuniyoshi was the first artist, I believe, to have a solo exhibition, happily, at the Whitney Museum of American Art, as it had then become. And he used the limelight, Kuniyoshi did, to write an essay called Universality in Art, that he published in the League Quarterly in 1949. And in that essay, Kuniyoshi is very clear. He says, stop looking at names and nationalities and these reductive ways of thinking about, art as a somehow reflection of one's race, but instead, quote unquote race, but instead look to the content on offer, look past this racializing way of thinking about form. And I take a lot of this interpretation, of course, from an art historian I admire named Jacqueline Francis, if you want to look at her work. But I think that Kuniyoshi's public and private insistence on art that could appeal to all eyes, and forms that were as fecund and fertile in the parts of the earth, there for all people to enjoy, and painted in that way, in that style, in that American folk art style, that Main Street style, was something that he really wanted us to understand, I think, about his work, in my view. Ruth Asawa, for her part, I think was also very invested in portraying plant material and plant life in a way that could beckon that kind of fertility or fecundity that belongs to all of us, and that transcends perhaps categories, in the same way that or in a similar way, let's say, though not the same way, that Noguchi, had a complicated relationship with his identity and called himself Eurasian, or in a similar way to Yasao Kuniyoshi's ambivalence about being racialized, or having his work, be racialized. Ruth Asawa in 1948 wrote a letter to her future husband and said that she no longer identified as, quote, Japanese or as American, but as a citizen of the universe. A citizen of the universe bears repeating. It's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? That at least is very, very inspiring to me. And like the stakes of her work that we discussed in our last session, I think these works that you see on your screen now and her engagement with plants in particular, I think gets to this sense of universal, the universal garden in which we all grow. And I think what she understood, she herself was a very active gardener, as I've come to understand her. She had a lot of plants, and she said, you know, children are like plants. If you water them, they'll grow, they'll thrive. And she identified too, not just as a plant mother, but also as an artist with vast maternal energy. And she had 6 children, and was a very kind of active mother to not only them and the plants, but also to her community in her activist practice, which we discussed a bit last time, but also to her artworks, which she in a way considered her children. Ruth Asawa then takes on this kind of mother nature-like capacity, at least to me, who could do anything, who could in a way replicate anything, who could grow anything. Her patterns of growth, her replicated forms are not just forms, but practice. They depart from an ability to do so, a Promethean kind of ability. And I think of that when I look at, for example, the work on the right, the potato print, which you can see was made from a literal potato that Asawa cut and then carved this negative space into, right, that couldn't be inked with these kind of lollipop-like branches. And this form, she then dipped in ink and stamped on paper in this repetitive way. This is a pattern to a certain degree, but it's also, to me, a statement of replicability, right? Like mitosis, 2 things that become 1, become 2, become 3, become 4, 6 like her children, many like the plants in her garden, many like the meals she served to her community in her kitchen as she would cook and write letters and take phone calls and correct her children and teach them art, and her grandchildren. Is it too much to read in the repeated act of stamping the potato on the paper, someone who believes in the beautiful fact that in nature on this earth, we are always in the process of being one repetition that will beget another? I don't know. But they have a gossamer quality, some of the printed potato forms that fade in and out of each other, as if cells, yes, maybe, as we discussed last week, or humans, or air bubbles, or molecules passing through time, appearing and disappearing in their moment of being. This work then brings that to light, the temporariness and the insistence of life. On the left is a large Sacramento delta leaf that the artist plucked and then inked and stamped on a massive piece of Japanese paper, a very translucent but robust paper that we have in our gallery. It's a very large work. It's like this big. It's like almost unbelievably larger than life size, though that is exactly life size. And perhaps not unlike Yasao Kuniyoshi's garden with its display, you know, of nature's fertility, Asawa here gives us just the absolutely stunning picture of what is absolutely the miracle of nature, that it appears, right, so organized, so miraculous, this huge 2-lobed spear-like form with its many veins reaching out, that when you see it in person, can see are not just inked and then impressed on the page, but which are rendered with the patterns of the ink itself, which kind of veined as ink is want to do. And so what you see when you look at this up close, and I think you can see it a little bit in this reproduction, is almost like a thumbprint or fingerprint of nature. This sense that the ink has created these little rivers, rivulets, these little patterns, like a fingerprint that leaves its literally indelible mark. That this one unique leaf lived a life that Asawa leaves for us. Not a trace, but something more, a kind of an object that we are meant, I think, to encounter, the leaf across the room that brings us to it. It also has a kind of skeletal look to it, perhaps suggesting the kind of bones that we will all eventually in some way or another turn into, a kind of mortality-laden work, at least to me, that also appears like two lungs, in an X-ray. Its polysemousness, its biomorphism extends beyond just the mere representation of it as a literal leaf. And I think this is partly the artist's gift. Ruth Asawa had another project, however, in this, what I would call her web of paper, for paper was so important to her throughout her practice, and it extended through her activist practice, but also it was a medium that she would turn to after she finished a wire sculpture to actually draw the sculpture, the kind of reverse of studying in paper to then render the more putatively accomplished work, the three-dimensional work. No, sometimes it was the opposite, the reverse for her, and other times the paper and the sculpture just went hand in hand. For this, another project I will mention here is her mask project, which I think extended throughout her life and perhaps started even as early as Black Mountain College, though maybe that's disputed, at least in the 1960s, when Asawa began inviting friends from her community and slathering their face with Vaseline, literally. And then you can see her in her process here, and you can see the shininess of the face, because that's what it is. It's Vaseline covered, and then put plaster over the face, plaster of Paris, and then remove the mask, creating a negative that she then put clay in the positive of and fired. These masks lived at her home in Noe Valley, California. And you can see there the artist standing in front of her famous redwood doors, which we'll discuss later on together, and its relationship to design, as well as the masks that kind of stare out at her, although they're all eyes closed, kind of her friends in a way, and literally her friends, many from Black Mountain College, including Gwendolyn Knight, the painter and the wife of also noted artist Jacob Lawrence, was one of the people who had their masks made, as well as Buckminster Fuller, her lifelong mentor from Black Mountain College, and many other notable art world people and friends, including Cyril Magnin, who's adjacent to the art world, I suppose, whose image you see on the right, who was a department store magnate, kind of, who commissioned Ruth Asawa to participate in his storefront culture by hanging some of her wire sculptures there, which we'll discuss a little later on. But notice something about this project. Notice that this artist, like Mother Nature, takes the likeness of so many of her friends in this very simple process, right? And thereby, like a death mask, it's reported that she learned this from like the tradition of making Roman death masks. But say it's broader than that. In so doing, she preserves the likeness, the morphology of those she loved or knew. She makes also a duplicate, a twin, a mitosis-like twin of the person she knew. And notice too, like, and I admit this is a stretch, but I say it anyways, like so many orbs reduplicating on the wall, so many faces, like little cells, little ball-like or blastula-like cells, all floating next to each other on the wall. We are, in very fundamental sense, all replicated versions of each other with slight variations. But we are all made from the same thing. Like her sculptures may suggest, being so many interlocking and departing lobes like cells, the cloth we're all cut from, those particles, right? Human particles that UNESCO saw the value of in challenging the divisions created by the concept of race. Like that, like the cloth we're all cut from, all of these faces are made from the same thing, right? They're made from clay. They're made from the mythic original material of humankind, when in the Greco-Roman legend, the man is fashioned from mud, from clay, thereby always and forever mythically associating the artist with the creator of humankind. Asawa is that, in a way, like Mother Nature, a creator of some kind, and in this case, of a beautiful, not quite metaphor, but evocation of our equality too. Yes, a radical, yes, a universalist, I think, way of thinking about the world that we all ought be instructed by. A truth. We're all made from clay of some kind or another. And notice too, our stupid divisions that we create between each other, vis-a-vis the concept of race, here are not embraced. But instead, Asawa does not cast the faces of those whom she knew in the color, for example, the skin color, which they would have borne in their lifetime. She mixes it all up. Some of the faces are lighter, some of them are darker, some are in between. As if what really mattered was the material they were made of. These belong now to the Stanford Cantor Center for the Arts, and I'll just note what a great acquisition by that organization. Stanford, also my alma mater. Asawa's interest in embracing the human form in all of its infinite and thereby universal diversity is perhaps furthered in this sketching practice she took up throughout her life, which was simply that she would take sketchbooks or loose leaves of paper, and while watching TV or having a conversation with somebody, she would just start drawing their likeness, almost making like a kind of mask, a kind of silhouette, let's say, as if in the 19th century tradition, of their face, capturing in their moment their morphological presence. But too, and I mean that really, not like their human, this is not like a Da Vincian thing where Asawa's evoking their, very particular, beating flesh and like veined bodies. And no, these are very spare sketches. These are about Asawa, a kind of plant, encountering other plants and gathering them in this beautiful bouquet. A bouquet of human beings that included also her own family and her own children, likenesses that have become precious to that family, and were precious in their time when they were made. Ruth Asawa had a very well-received exhibition in Los Angeles that in many ways helped to really launch her career in the 60s. And I believe there was a work there that was a drawing of one of her children that was not for sale, so even given the ambitions of this young artist, who could certainly, having known her biography, have used the income in that moment, she declined to sell such a drawing, because these are works that speak to her humanity, her encounter with those she knew and loved, and to her philosophy of humanity, that we are all one. A citizen of the universe. I'd like to connect these ideas to another artist who I haven't really seen compared to Ruth Asawa, but who I think could make a compelling case, and who will also, I think, help us to think about how Asawa may have influenced the history of design. Harry Bertoia was an artist with Italian heritage who was immigrated to the United States, like many Italian Americans, went through challenges associated with anti-Italian sentiment, and was somebody who went through a kind of school for assimilation to create that, quote unquote, melting pot, a notion that might sound happy today, but in fact has very insidious origins. For example, at Ford Motor Company, where Bertoia's father, I believe, worked, where there was one such assimilation program that taught immigrants English in a very rigorous way and Americanized them. And for example, at this Ford training program, at one of the graduation ceremonies was the graduates would climb up a big ladder and jump into a big pot, metaphorically joining American culture, as it were. But really, that was a process created by people like Ford to, erase and minimize what was understood as immigrant cultural incursion. And there's a lot of direct racism and eugenic thought that goes into Ford's programs and many others. Ford had one of the most highly circulated newspapers, because it was at all of his dealerships, that was incredibly eugenic in its thought. So just putting that as a background, Bertoia nonetheless found his way as an artist, and he ended up teaching at Cranbrook, where he, like many artists, became interested in form and function, but also in ideas not dissimilar to those that Asawa encountered at Black Mountain College around universal principles in nature, math, and physics. Bertoia himself would actually work professionally as an engineer. And I'd like to point your attention to this work, which we own, and is the very small work. It's about this big. It's a monotype that Bertoia made shortly after he got a job working for Eames, the furniture maker, Charles Eames, in Los Angeles. And Bertoia, right around this time, actually had a falling out with Eames, but I've read, but he was trying to make it on his own as an artist, and he began making these monotype prints that he thought he could sell and really sustain his practice. What does this have to do with Ruth Asawa? Because that's just setting the stage. Well, look at this form. Look at how Bertoia has laid down the ink with probably a roller and a stylus, this kind of layered visual field of red and black that almost has a static-like look to it, right? And has these whipping lines of a kind of blue and orange and green. There's kind of a spiral of green at mid-center left that may suggest kind of the movement, perhaps, of an object or something through this visual field that the artist is tracing or leaving us a diagram of movement, if you will, that might be orbital in a way in nature, suggest spirals, for example, that might happen in space as bodies move and collide against each other. Ideas that bring the mysterious but bespelling and convincing patterns in nature that Asawa was also interested in to bear in a work of art that I would argue was also in tune with the possibilities of here not biomorphism, but a kind of a visual, an aesthetic of science and its promises to bring a greater sense of unity to the viewer, unity with humanity. And Bertoia, of course, became very famous and became established at least by the 60s, for this chair, the diamond chair, which many of you may just immediately recognize because it became iconic, that he designed in 1950, 1952. It's chrome-plated steel. And he made this at a time not, sort of coincidentally, but let's say synchronistically, while Einstein was, basically discovering the tenets that will become the theory of relativity, and is looking, in a sense, at the fabric of space-time to do so. Now, these timelines don't really align. Bertoia's work is not, it's graph, it's grid that bends around the body like space-time bends around a planet, cannot, I don't think, be exactly connected. But there is a sense of prefiguration of these ideas, or that they're at least in the ethers, right? That the beautiful order that scientists, astronomers are interested in this moment, including to describe space, to describe gravity, which are, out there at this time, in which Bertoia is encountering at this time, may have inflected this chair, because Bertoia actually, in 1944, begins making a monthly trip to, I think it's called the Phipps Astronomy Center in Los Angeles, to attend lectures there, to learn about space, to learn about some of these astronomical theories that, in that very romantic way, must have made the artist, and of course, and makes us now feel how small and really bound up together we are on this tiny planet, right? Like the wonders out there that make us closer, and as this unique species, as this unique presence, that here I'm connecting to a work of art that Ruth Asawa made, actually. So we're kind of bringing to bear these two sort of moments in, one moment in art history, one moment in design history, in complete intention to break that, what I view as very stupid split that, to me, art historians seem to be more obsessed with than anybody else, the split between design history and art history, which artists like Bertoia and like Ruth Asawa were not invested in. They were very fluid about what was art, what was design, what was in between, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And for example, Ruth Asawa here has taken this cafe chair and she's made this a very large work. It's huge. It's like this big. And we have this here at the Whitney now in the 1950s. So around the time, almost exactly, that Bertoia would have been designing this chair, a chair that Asawa was almost certainly familiar with. And here, Ruth has used a cut felt tip pen to demarcate all of the kind of space around the chairs, perhaps almost suggesting, right, that the subject of this work is actually the kind of space-time or the air or the atmosphere around the chairs, perhaps much in the same way that Bertoia's chair may kind of explore that, the kind of ethereal or bent spatial presence around the body. And I think that this investment, if it is one that Asawa may have made in the air around the body in that work, was made with a tool here that you see is this felt tip pen that you can see she cut, that Flowmaster ink pen that we have illustrated in our catalog, that is completely unrelated to the image on the right, but which for some reason, to me, makes these two artists akin, which I'll talk about in a minute. So here is actually the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. So I misspoke, it's called the Griffith Observatory, where Bertoia started to go in 1944. And I can't help but see how that skeletal, that exoskeletal structure, right, of the observatory, that both contains and is the diaphanous, the cage-like opening around and framing the space through which the telescope perhaps will move, is not unlike Bertoia's chair, which too has that cage-like presence that I imagine Bertoia there listening to lectures about space and astronomy, discoveries on the forefront, and looking up, gazing at this cage above him that contained and kind of framed the air, the stars even above, and making this chair to hold in a way that vision, that the Griffith Observatory was in some ways his philosophical object, his like tool, Bertoia's tool to discover this form that that may connect to how all of our bodies, our behinds fall into these shapes every day, right? That Asawa's tool, this felt-tipped pen that she cut, too, may suggest like the kind of the possibility of taking something like the square that this would depress on a piece of paper and repeating it ad infinitum to kind of create this a kind of mesh or network whereby she could, like the observatory, frame empty space, two tools adjacent to each other in their moment in time, considering two chair-like forms that here are not falsely divided from each other like art and design, but are of a piece. And Bertoia was very interested in these kinds of terms. For example, here's a picture of him, and we'll only stop briefly here just to look at this kind of incredible image of him admiring this installation he made for the Zenith Radio Corporation, which was called the Sculptural Group Symbolizing the World's Communication in the Atomic Age. And you can see it has perhaps, Asawa-like interest in these repeated squares, right, that emanate out from a single point, almost Big Bang-like. And this was a lighted sculpture, one of his only at the time, or perhaps his only at the time. And he says, quote, we use the atom for power for many things. We can measure it, we can weigh it. I think we can. We have a very good idea of its makeup, but who has ever seen the atom? It is unseen, yet we live in a time dominated by its invisible force. There's the key word. It is, in a sense, this invisible force, these elements of the atomic age that I am trying to give sculptural shape and form to. That invisible field all around us, like cells, like molecules, like DNA, like the atom that we know but can't know, but that nonetheless bind us all together as one. These may seem like highfalutin philosophical ways of thinking about art or Bertoia or Asawa, sure, and they are. Universalism is always that, and one not be afraid of it. One ought not be afraid of it, in my opinion, but should instead understand its limitations that nonetheless find their way into interior design, which to me makes its limitations less so. So malleable is this form of universalism that it could even be above your fireplace. Here you can see at left what is described as the scintillating quality of this sculptured metal by Harry Bertoia holds attention without being too dominant in this living area. And that is true, right? It is this almost field of little molecules or particles that float above the fireplace, that duplicate the elements, the atoms of the fire itself that roar beneath it, right? But also the air, the cloud, the smoke in the living room, a kind of replacement for, maybe a chandelier, but more than that, think about being there. That this moment of design proposed in Detroit, Michigan, right, would include the experience of somebody sitting in a living room like that and gazing up at this slightly sparkling, perhaps atom field-like or cloud-like presence. Asawa was also an artist who work was frequently featured in interior design scenarios. One year, she made $2,700, a significant amount of money in that moment in time for her, just from selling her sculptures alone in the J. Magnin, the JM, the Josef Magnin department store, which Cyril Magnin had founded, in which you can see, I've included her death mask here, his death mask, not death mask, excuse me, his mask that I related to death masks earlier, here on the screen to give you a sense of his presence, that this real person brought Asawa into the kind of same room that Bertoia is brought into adjacent to you. This way of embracing interior design, not as a separate category, but as a place where art is also living and breathing, would have been too of a piece and with Asawa's own artistic community. For when Asawa did a trade, an art trade with her mentor, Josef Albers, Albers sent her a painting and she sent Albers a Moebius strip sculpture that he hung in his room. And so did Buckminster Fuller, and so did all of the artists she gifted her work to. These works ended up not always in white boxes, but in domestic settings that this artist, this Mother Nature, understood as serious as anything. Her feminism was not to dismiss her life creating volumes of domestic possibility, cooking, designing, child rearing, parenting, making sculpture, starting organizations. No, all of that was for her a creative act, and that was her kind of feminism, was to blend them all. And I think it was natural then for Asawa to make something like this. The tide, it's actually a translucent panel that we have here displayed at the Whitney, through which you can see through this kind of pie tin punched metal that you can almost glimpse the ocean behind, but it's a kind of window. This form that derives from for example, 19th century engravings that she collected at Black Mountain College, among other places, here finding the form of expression in terms of a window. And Asawa was very much so interested in the presence of her sculptures in her domestic space, in her house. And in Noe Valley, for example, you can see here, her house is beautifully filled with her sculpture. And it is today, too. You can see on the left a more contemporary image with a huge likeness of her, and so many other objects and curiosities from a life lived from a Mother Nature who made art as a way to teach us how close we are to each other, how much a family we are, that we all live in one house, in a way, like hers. Thank you so much for your time in this two-part course. And I'm going to open up to questions now. We have a little time, maybe about 5 minutes for questions. If there are any, please go ahead and enter them into the chat, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Or in the Q&A. Yes, it's a question about whether this was about Asawa's work on paper. And yes, the first part of this focused a lot on that, but this part of the series expanded to consider her influences beyond that, with a focus on how her paper prompted those influences. But thank you for asking that. That's a good clarification question. Yes, John Cahill, if I know who that is, that's a noted scholar, is correct. was not interned. Noguchi spent 4 months in Poston on apparently a voluntary basis. That is correct. There's a lot to say about that. So thank you for adding that and for being here. I'm sorry if I'm getting your identity wrong. There's a good question about Asawa, perhaps, and pregnancy. And some of Asawa's children were adopted. But Asawa did take on a stamp for all of her works on paper, which is 3 lines nested together that she said derived from the form of a dancer, a person dancing ballet with their hands above their head in this kind of O shape. However, I think it's fair to say that it looks a bit, that has a little bit of a uterine form, or at least like an onion-like form or something. Certainly nesting, eggs, yolks, things like that, I think are topical to Asawa's work. She did ultimately, originally, start making her hanging wire sculptures from a form that was traditionally used to contain egg baskets. And certainly motherhood is and gender is an incredibly important part of Asawa's work and feminism. That is the embrace of those things. Yes, my academic paper on Asawa is available through the Smithsonian American Art Museum journal American Art is a question. What happened to Ruth's home? It's still there and occupied by family members, I believe, who have preserved much of it, including her redwood doors, which we unfortunately didn't get to in much detail at all, but which she carved with her children, and which are still there and have been shown. Thank you for all of the thank yous. I'm just scrolling through the questions. Okay, I think I got to everything. All right. Well, thank you so much for attending, and I hope you get to see the exhibition in person. It's really a knockout. And if you don't, we have lots of materials, educational materials online that will help you to explore Ruth Asawa's life, her work, the legacy she left for us in paper. And I would also encourage you to go to the Ruth Asawa website, which is operated by the family in part and does an excellent job of laying out some of the stakes of her work, the timeline of her life, and her corpus. Okay, thanks so much. Bye.